I'll just say welcome everybody. I'm
Yeah,
sorry
sure.
I've been a little bit out of touch with the BIM4Housing stuff for a bit. It was a bit sort of chaotic at the end of last year, but hopefully that's over now. Are we
Yeah.
recording? Yes. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can't recall. I don't think I was able to make the last one, but what I've just looked at, as ever, sort of preparing at the too late down the line, but I've looked at the last meeting, and this was the one that I think Debbie you led mostly on with competence, and there was I've looked at the notes. So what I'd just like to do is share with you. Obviously, Mike and Jim, a number of people were on this, and Brett, I see that you were on it as well. But I think what's really helpful, I don't know if you use this resource, but this is where Richard gets one of his colleagues to basically take down what's been covered in the meeting. So I think the principle of that, I mean, even if you're in the meeting, it's 3 months ago, so you can, I imagine that things may have drifted from that. But what I think was very useful is to look at things from this competency perspective and see how different disciplines were addressing it. So reading through this, there was an interesting take from you, Jim, but also from Nick contributed, as did Sharon from the fire penetration people. What Sharon's arguing for, I think, is that the passive fire protection ought to be regulated, which is quite an interesting perspective. I guess in some ways it is being done at the moment as well. The regulator will be overseeing that, won't they? So I don't know what that would mean for it to be more formally regulated. Paula was making the point here that we've been discussing for the last sort of 8 year or so about the move to get design work prescriptively sorted out before construction starts. And then moving on from there, Mike or Isan there was, I can't remember where Isan's from. Is he, can anybody remember? I think he's from one of the housing associations. I can't remember. Could you look that up, Jess?
He's from Genesis.
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, Notting Hill Genesis. So he's from a landlord. And then also, Mike, the point that you were making here, Mike, is that there's, do we need additional levels of competency, or should we be working on the basis that you're going through the CPD, so therefore do we need another layer of competency? So before we move on to some of the things today, I just wondered if, because a number of the people on the call were involved in this, are there any actions that we perhaps should be considering here that we ought to be looking at? Open that question out a little bit.
George, I've got a couple of suggestions. Yeah, is unless anybody else has seen it, I haven't seen any update from the interim industry competence committee, yes, on what they're doing, yes, and moving to the new regime, yes. So I think having line of sight of that would be useful. And obviously there's lots of competency working groups that have done various reports, and some of them, the sort of fire stuff, to a certain extent crosses over many of them. Yes, so we should perhaps do a little review of what might be relevant there. And then I'm now involved, and some people may have heard this, there's another group that's been set up called the Joint Competence Initiative, and it's to do with the building envelope facade sector, which obviously has big issues. And I'm wondering whether we should, they're only in the early days of setting up their scope and activities. And again, it's sort of fairly infuriating because there's very inexact intents and language being used, but whether that's a group we need to influence or have an eye on, I don't know. You know, I'm not an expert in whatever the building envelope sector is. I mean, I have a reasonable understanding, but you know, it's not my domain. So those are some suggestions. I mean, for me, you know, I think there is a move towards more formal schemes or regimes for both organizational competence and individual competence. Yes. So I don't think CPD is going to be enough going forward. So anyway, enough from me.
Jim.
I would just like to suggest that more emphasis is put on the auditing of ISO 9001, as you quite rightly point out, Debbie, because everything crosses over from maybe one discipline to the next. I noticed that British Standards are starting a competency standard for fire risk assessment at long last. So from that point of view, each one of the disciplines may have a particular competency criteria, but I still think that ISO 9000 encompassing a quality assurance scheme throughout the organization would, at least if it was audited more vigorously, would detect competency at all levels within the organization.
I agree entirely, but obviously there's the 99001, which is the built environment version of that. Yes. Well, so there's a new version, and a lot of people don't seem to be aware of it. Also, I'll put in the chat, there was a very good interview done by a senior guy from Waits with Dame Judith Hackett, and she very much strengthened the message about quality and safety. Yes. And then being two sides of the coin, and that's what this is all about. So I think you're spot on there, Jim. I'll just find that and put that in the chat.
You have to remember about me is I come from the specialist contractor side, where the actual application and the manufacture is of a sort of more important than the actual construction elements as far as my disciplines are concerned. So yeah, both are very important, very, very important.
Does anybody else have any contribution on that? Mike, you had some views at the last session.
Yeah, I mean, I think the message about competencies is definitely growing. I think we're seeing more and more of it coming out into many different aspects. I guess the questions that still lie is what evidence we need to provide to demonstrate our competencies and which is the best route to take. I think it probably echoes what I said previously in the last conversation. What we're seeing is that the RIBA has its CPD requirements and such alike, which actually gives us the evidence to provide our competencies, but whether that's sufficient is probably a question that I would open up.
Anybody else have a view on that?
Hi, yeah, it's Paul. Morning. Sorry, I joined a little bit late this morning. Yeah, we're looking into this. We're trying to get to the bottom of exactly what's required, but it does seem that a CSCS card for going and working on a site will be a requirement, and then you need a level 2 NVQ, which will include your specialist subject plus health and safety, site conditions and all those sorts of things, and they consist of 6 or 7 modules that you have to get to, but whether that's an actual requirement or not, we don't seem to know yet, and we're trying to get to the bottom of what it is. But that's there. Paul, and sorry
Paul,
Debbie.
Can I ask, Paul, I mean, that seems to resonate with what Working Group 2 have done, Competence Working Group 2 have done in terms of installers, but also all current CSCS cards are no longer valid by September this year. And everyone's going to have to renew their cards, and that card will, you won't just automatically get it, or the grandfather rights go, if everyone is aware of that. So there is going to be a big sort of upskilling bit here as well. But I think, you know, I think at the moment, what I've seen from looking across lots of the working groups of reports, yes, and their recommendations is it's slightly different, the sort of model everyone's taking. You know, that's one model that you've suggested, but some of the others are different, yes, in terms of the engineering group, yes, and it's contextualized standards and stuff like that. So I mean, so perhaps trying to just understand what's going on in each group might be useful for us. I mean, that's something wouldn't take me long to do, George, yes, if I find a window. So, but sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to check everyone understood that the current cards will be invalid soon.
Yeah, Debbie, that'll be, if you can find out what the actual truth is, that'd be really good, because we're trying to find out in various different groups. But it does say for a CSCS card particularly, it does seem to be level 1 or level 2 NVQ, and there are very few assessors. And this is the point, it's the difference between having a certificated qualification from somebody who dishes these things out, so a college or professional institute, and somebody was talking about CPD, and you will be then required to do CPD, but just doing an industry course potentially isn't going to be enough, and that's the bit we need to get to the bottom of really quite quickly, because as Debbie said, grandfather rights just disappear. The other thing about, somebody mentioned BS 9001, and BS 9001 has always concentrated on training and training matrices. It's not actually concentrated on competency, and I think that's something that probably needs to change. And I always give the example as I can go and teach a room half full of, and I'm not being rude to monkeys or anybody else or trying to upset anybody, but I could train a room half full of monkeys and half full of contractors, and the contractors could go to site tomorrow and do something and show their competency, but the monkeys couldn't. And this is the difference between training and competency. And it's very people have got to understand that training is not competency. Competency is something that is assessed by somebody else. Yeah, and I think that's very clear.
Training is an input, you know, it's not necessarily an output. But the other thing, and in case people aren't aware, that in the built environment sector, you know, anything that's to do with a level 2 or 3 is based on occupational standards. Yes, 60% of those standards are being upgraded, you know, and that process will finish early sort of 2024, and all of these occupational standards are changing dramatically to cover digital, to cover stuff to do with the building safety environment, to deal with sustainability and net zero. So there's going to be enormous change in itself, you know. So it's not just people, you know, having to refresh their cards through doing a qualification or up thing. So what at the moment I can't get a picture is if you change an occupational standard by say 50%, yes, you know, will people be able to just do a short module to you know, upskill in that? Yes, there doesn't seem to be any sort of view on that, but I'm in deep discussions with IFATE at the moment that sets up all these standards up, because you know, there's enough for people to cope with at the moment without a lot of this to cope with as well, if you see what I mean. So
Jim's got his hand up.
Absolutely. Sorry, just to that seems to be the issue, Debbie, that the MVQs do seem to be modular, and you would cover lots of modules against certain NOSes, and then perhaps your industry specific one would just be one module, and then you might need to do another module, and my example is ductwork fitters would be one module, but then fire damper fitting would be another one. And but you wouldn't necessarily then, you're not going to go and do all the other 5 common modules again, or if you have, that would be absolutely barking mad. But it's this it's nobody seems to be giving us any clear direction on this, and if you have got a mainline that to Debbie, I can get that into lots of other trade associations, because it's getting very important at the moment.
Thank you. Thanks,
Just before
Paul.
I
I'll
hand over
follow up
to
on that. Yeah.
just before you come in, Jim, what obviously we want to do is that there's our focus, I think, should be on the information management side of things, because that's really what BIM4Housing in essence is. That's our perspective, our contribution. So I don't know whether people would agree with that, but I think that should be our approach, because there's a big ocean to boil here, isn't there? Whereas therefore I think we should be doing is looking at how what information do we need to provide the means for people to be made more competent, and also for us to be able to verify their competence. I think that should be the perspective through which we work. Does anybody have a view on that, just before I hand over to Jim?
I've just got one view, is that inherent in that statement, George, is it's kind of cross-discipline, yes, cross roles, yes.
Absolutely.
So which is why we go across these things, and obviously there's many other people offering kind of certification and competence stuff around sort of BIM stuff, yes, and information management. So there is quite a lot going on in that area. But
yeah. I'm not suggesting that we should be doing, but I think the problem is, to some extent, what is it that people are certifying? And I think possibly that's the element that we need to contribute to. If it's the case that there are things that should be being assessed at the moment that possibly aren't being. I mean, certainly the work that we're doing, the more projects that we're getting involved in, the lack of expertise and competence, and also possibly attention to detail of the people that are producing BIM models, is quite shocking. And the impact of that down the line is significant. And I don't think there's adequate realization in some cases of that impact. So that's certainly one of the things. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're delivering is a digital asset as well as a physical asset. And the digital asset is part of what the regulator is going to be considering. So we need, in my view, I mean, this is something that Nick and I have been talking about for years. There's far too much of even what's being considered at the moment under the Building Safety Act that isn't properly machine readable, isn't in that form. And I think it is something that, although it seems that we've lost the battle to some extent to get that specified as being a clear requirement, I think as an industry, it's the only way we're actually going to be able to deliver it. Sorry, Jim, what did you want to cover?
Well, I think we're in agreement in terms of, if we're going to be looking at the problem, this is an advisory format, and the thing is about how we as advisors are competent to advise, and what due diligence should be paid right at the start of the construction. We identified early on in the discussions, in the round table discussions, that effectively most of defect was caused by specification. And I think we're now looking with 9901 is the poor bloke with the screwdriver. Well, if he's got a bad specification to deal with, regardless of how many CPDs he's attended or what courses he's been on, he's not the person that's going to change the specification that started incorrectly at stage one. So the due diligence from advisory point of view is what we would recommend to clients that they should go through before selecting subcontractors, or even key contractors, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean,
Nick.
the bulk of the current BIM training, I mean, apart from application specific stuff, is around ISO 19650. And the bulk of that is about process. We produced part 4 recently to try and rebalance things a bit and get people to think about data in the short term, medium term, and long term, information sustainability, general criteria of coherence in models, which I think is probably one of the things that George is hinting at. But I think we do need a data qualification or I mean, George and I remember when they were called systems analysts, but some kind of qualification about people who were able to abstract and make manageable the actual information requirements connected with regulatory inspections and to do with asset management too. I think one of the things that's happening is that Building Smart is going to be promoting a technical standard called IDS, which is it can be created from an interface, and it's a set of rules, quality rules for the model that you want. And so for the first time, there'll be something systematic about saying, these are my information requirements. Now we can test the deliverable. And I think that, assuming we produce these IDSs of an appropriate level, that will change things because suddenly there will be an external mechanism. IDSs can be shared or generated by a client and delivered to a designer, or a community could agree what an IDS should be for fire safety or fire safety doors. Perhaps I should just restrict it a bit. And I think perhaps the direction will be, rather than going for competency in data, to actually say there will be contractually testable outcomes from the delivery of BIM information.
Yep.
I mean, Emma
and
is
validation,
saying,
progressive validation as well, so that it doesn't get left until the end, which is
yeah. I think the Emma Hooper has sort of been publishing that they've got 9,000 data quality rules now, all in Calibri. And I have to say that is the least interoperable tool in terms of the rule sets. So it makes me weep that they have a set of information standards, but it can't really be shared.
Or possibly interrogated either, Nick.
Well, I mean, yeah, they can generate the results, and I'm sure they can summarize them one way or another. But I think one of the next wave has got to be that there is independent, machine readable information requirements.
Yes,
and that could be, if it's adopted, it could be a game changer.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Sorry. I think there's also a sort of basic thing. I mean, if you look at most of the standards that underpin, especially a lot of the sort of level 2, 3, even up to 4 qualifications at the moment, the concept of models is rarely there, if you know what I mean. I mean, there's a sort of whole need still to some basic education around people that, we live in a world of models now, yes, and those models are going to, be checked, be in contractual requirements and all the rest. Yeah, so I think there's a sort of there's a basic, there is a higher order here, yes, which is obviously what Building Smart is trying to sort of you know, move to do as well. But equally, you know, if you've got people going into you know, NVQs and apprenticeships at the moment, and they don't get any insight into what a model is, that's pretty poor show. So
I think I mean, I don't think it's a secret that I'm trying very hard to get BSI to adopt the Building Smart certification as the element of their training. Others are trying to persuade the BRE to include it, in order to get some balance back into these BIM fundamentals and 19650 courses.
But you know, it's the same with the competence standards that BSI are doing. I mean, I'm fighting to say they should not be charged for. Yes, it's not going to help the industry if they make these put a cost barrier in. You know, industry is contributing. Yeah.
I mean that. I know about the cost models at BSI, and either industry sponsors these documents enough to compensate the BSI for making them free, or government sponsors them enough to make them free, or they are chargeable. It's one thing for industry to contribute to these authoring these standards, but you know, there's another level of commitment which we got in PAS 1192 Part 6, where the industry funded it.
Yeah. And the other piece of the work that is relevant that around the sort of competency piece that most people aren't aware of, we have a unit, a government unit now called the Unit of Future Skills. I don't know if anybody's heard of this, and they have done a lot of foresighting work. So basically what they've done is look at what are the sort of technological and sort of other changes that are coming from digitalization, electrification, net zero. What does that mean in terms of the sort of capabilities organizations need, and then the competences? Yes. So a lot of that work. So for example, you know, it may be more skewed towards manufacturing than the built environment, but you know, they've already got decent competency profiles of a golden thread engineer. Yes. A digital twin data manager and all the rest. So there's a lot of other stuff out there that is really useful to use. But the problem is at the moment is most people don't know it exists. So
no, that would be a hot potato, a digital twin qualification. Who's produced that?
No, it's not necessarily a qualification. These are looking at, you know, future organizational capabilities and the sort of tasks and new competencies related to them. They're, you know, relating those to what might be qualifications is not the role of the foresight bit. Their job is to do the horizon scanning and stuff. Yes. But, you know, there's some good stuff that's been done. Yes. That will be available soon to look at and to contextualize. Yes. You know, it will need, if it's come from other sectors, it will need some kind of contextualization. And there was meant to be government funding going towards that, doing that in the built environment, but it's been delayed. But you know, it's certainly some good work to consider. Yeah. Because obviously, you know, you know, a lot of these concepts, you know, are the same in other sectors. Yes. So yeah.
One of the things that we've been in some of the other working groups we've been active on, and in fact Paul White I think has also been helping Paul Matsoli on this. I'm going to share something with you that Paul White can possibly give more explanation to than I can. But this is something that that Paul Matsoli and colleagues have been working on to as part of the passive fire side of things, to try and put down some rules. So here, for example, what this is to explain the different types of fire dampers and smoke control dampers, and the different types will need to be selected according to the type of wall they're going into. So one of the things that they've done is they've started to produce a decision tree. That's what I call it anyway. So this is identifying what the risks are. Paul, would you be in a position to explain this a little bit better than me?
Yes, I can give you a bit of background to it. I mean, I have been doing a lot of work with Paul, and I'm obviously trying to pull the whole industry together. So there's, I think I mentioned this to you the other day, George, that a lot of work is going on in lots of different places, and we've got to make sure it's all equal. But that's a different issue. But yeah, the whole point about this is that you can't wait until the guy turns up to site to fit the fire damper. If you've gone through various bits and pieces, you've discovered that there's an escape route risk or a sleeping risk, and therefore you need a specific type of damper to fulfill that. So you go through that, but the key point is then you need to know what the compartmentation is in the building, and of course somebody turning up to fit something hasn't got a clue about any of that, but they're starting to need to, because at some point they might just need to say stop, or rethink this, or we can't fit it as you've told us to fit it because we can't follow the instructions properly. So then we look at the wall, we look at the size of the building, we look at the compartmentation, and then once somebody's decided on the wall, then you have to select the damper that's the correct one for being installed in that wall. And I think we're probably all aware that a lot of specs say everything has to come from the same supplier, and you can't do that anymore, because if somebody selected a certain wall type, one manufacturer may not have a tested solution to that. And basically that's what this thing takes you through, and it gives you some options that you have. I mean, the one you're actually looking at, I think, is smoke control dampers, and those ones you can mount in a duct or in a wall depending on the application. So in a basement you install them in a duct, and in an above ground smoke control system you'd install them in the wall or the shaft. So there's a huge amount of decisions that need to be made right at the start, and we're looking at we're working on a NOS for the design for and select fire dampers at the moment. And it was interesting to hear Debbie saying that there's a lot of other things being considered, because the one that we're looking at seems to be very narrow, and the people who are developing it just do not understand the problem, let alone the product. But they want it to reflect what they do at the moment, not what they should be doing, and it's a bit of a mess.
Paul, is that a NOS or is it an occupational standard? That
yeah,
comes
national
under
occupational standard. Yeah, a NOS, a national occupational
it's a NOS.
standard. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Because we're working on those for fire damper install at the moment through, I think it's the Summit Skills, which is attached through BESA, and again the struggle to get the right number of, or the right people involved in any peer review is so difficult, because there seems to be quite a lot of people tied up with doing what they want to do rather than opening it up to people who actually know what they should be doing.
Yeah. So because it'd be interesting to see whether occupational standards under IFATE are doing something similar. I can find out and check that. Yes, but so that's that's under Summit Skills rather than CITB. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's this, and this is the other problem. There doesn't seem to be a map of who's responsible for which bit, because we spoke to as FETA, we spoke to CITB, and they said, oh, we don't deal with that bit. Yeah, but you've approved this training scheme. Oh, have we? Oh. And trying to work out who's responsible for each area is very difficult, because it seems to be just very diverse. And if somebody hasn't done any work on it, the first answer is oh, that's somebody else, because they're very busy and there's too few people as usual. Yeah.
No, I mean it's fairly chaotic at the moment. You know, nobody has a vision of who's doing what and where the overlap is here. Yes, but
no, it's not just me finding that out. Then that's true.
No, it's a mess. But I'll try and see from under with iFate, because I've got good relationships there, whether they're doing anything in our sort of domain that we should be aware of or need to influence. Yes, as an action. So I put that as an action. Okay.
But sorry, George, just to finish, does that sort of give you an idea of? I mean, this everybody thinks that it's a utility component that you just buy off the shelf, and when you actually look at what you should be doing, everybody's going, "We've not done that ever," and it's becoming very, because it's always being pushed. This is the other issue with contractual stuff. It gets pushed down, so nobody's actually doing the design because they let it as a design and build to a contractor, and the contractor doesn't have any design capabilities, but they've signed a design and build contract based on what then becomes a nebulous design because the people who've done the design and the specification have no responsibility for it.
I think that's really the message, isn't it? That we're arriving at, that it's as Paul McSolly says. If people don't know Paul McSolly, I think you probably do, but he's from Mace. But he's basically he's picked up on what has come out of the Golden Thread work that we did, and that's this point about descriptive specifications and prescriptive specifications. And the products need to be selected, identified and selected before construction starts, which obviously is a big change. But the significance of that is quite profound. And therefore, from an information management point of view, we need to find a way that the people that are making those prescriptive selections are given the information that they need in a form that they can easily consume. And in my view, that needs to be digital, because there's just an overwhelming amount of documentation that people would otherwise have to read and interpret.
Is this another symptom of the old problem when consulting MEP engineers used to say, we don't do coordination? It sounds like they don't do specification either. Yes. Which does pose the third question, which I won't say out loud.
Yes. Yeah. It absolutely does, Nicholas. Yes, I'm beginning to wonder.
Yeah.
But I think certainly on the HRBs going forward with Gateway 1 and Gateway 2, that in theory you can't get past Gateway 2 now without coordinating some of this stuff, because you can't just leave it for somebody to solve the problem later because you've caused the problem in the first place.
The other angle that I mean, this obviously this flow diagram is overwhelming, but you could at least argue that the information, the decision points here, is a schedule of information that should be available to the subcontractor. Now, because they can't, apparently they can't select a product without it, and so you can turn it around and say that the consulting engineers and presumably the architects as well for the compartmentation or the fire engineer have got to provide this information, because without it, subcontractors can't do what they're being asked to do.
I've come to that conclusion as well, Nick. Essentially, I think this would be some sort of decision tree, wouldn't it? With
I hope so.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, you can work your way through it and come out with the answer. The problem is it's not as simple as you would like it to be.
Yeah, but
because you've got to choose a wall, and you've got to look at the space risk. They say that there's a lot to it, but it's everything's tied together, and somebody who's actually designing for and selecting fire dampers needs a whole load of information that usually resides in different places. Yeah. So some of it will be with the architect, some of it will be with the consultant, some of it be with the equipment supplier, Some of it might be with a specialist contractor. It's really complicated.
But
But
there's
it's
also
not.
it's also a language thing here. If you look in some of the standards, they always refer to things like fire dampers as sort of ancillary items, yes?
Yes.
Which is very, very dangerous wording, yes? Because if you're dealing with some kind of multi-skilled operative who's or a supervisor who's meant to be overseeing the fire stopping, look what happened, George, on the PBS project. That's one of the problems they had, was the fire stopping, you know. Is if you train them and say, well, this is all ancillary items, you don't take the thing so seriously. It's not so important. So there's very dangerous language being used here in some of the standards. If that makes sense. Sorry to jump in, but I've got all the apprenticeship standards in machine readable form, so I can go and query. I can go and put in fire dampers and see where they appear in the standards and the language they use.
Yeah, fire stopping. I may be mistaken. Isn't fire stopping a different subject from fire dampers?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, fire stopping's for pipes and cables.
Yeah.
Right.
And penetration sealing for ducts and dampers is specific to the duct and damper from the specific manufacturer. And you can't just put fire stopping that would be used for fire for cables and pipes straight round a duct, because, and the difference is that a pipe and a cable have no fire performance for themselves. They're just a dumb part that needs protection. Whereas the fire damper and the fire resisting duct have their own standards for fire testing and their own performance requirements, and therefore they have to be tested as a system. But it's so refreshing to hear somebody else actually realise that point.
Is that Nick? Sorry, is that Paul? Why Paul McSolly got me to change fire stopping to being penetration seals?
Yes.
So
yes,
penetration seals is the overarching term that would include fire stopping. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, pretty much. But also penetration seals. For instance, if you have a socket let into a wall, that's called a partial penetration, and that will have a special seal around it because it doesn't go right through the wall. And you have linear gap seals that run along the top of walls to allow for floors flexing, etc. So there's a whole range of different things, and all of them have different tests and requirements. But you're right that penetration seals is the safest term to use. Yes.
Cool. And but so there's two dimensions to that. There's the penetration seal, but there's also the function of that particular damper. So in this case, the smoke control damper, that's part of a smoke control system.
Yeah, that's. I mean, you'll be making me get my soapbox out in a minute, George. But yes, the fire damper is for use in ventilation systems, and it must shut to stop fire getting through ductwork or around the outside of ductwork where it goes through a wall. And some of them have what's called an S or reduced leakage classification, which means that they actually stop some of the smoke getting out as well. And that's why they've been called fire and smoke dampers, and I don't use that term anymore. Whereas a smoke control damper may be open or closed, and you don't know until there's a fire which one of them is going to be open or closed, and you have to drive them to that position to let smoke and heat out of the building.
Cool. Okay.
This does remind me of my favourite subject, which is definitions, and definitions are very key to information sharing, because there are many, even in my skill set, in terms of everybody calls things signs, where signs are split into about 8 different categories, and so definitions are very much very important, especially in the first stages of putting these things out
for procurement. Absolutely.
I totally agree, but also feeding them into those who are developing standards. Yes, so you know, to do with competence. So if we've got a definition set, that's very helpful.
Well,
So,
that's one good thing about British standards. British standards are very, very, very
yeah.
tight on definitions within disciplines, and they do check and recheck to make sure that under the protocol for writing standards that there's no confusion.
And there's in this area there's no confusion in the standards, Jim, but there's a huge amount of confusion in the approved documents.
Yeah.
And actually no, and in the standard and 9999 and 9991, which have been wrong because they've had the wrong people giving them the definitions. And
in building regulations, they're calling fire and rescue deployment signs as wayfinding. Well, wayfinding is within the international understanding for evacuation.
Yes, so that sounds to me like exit rather than ingress.
Yeah, well, but having said that, you know, wayfinding is also about evacuation in certain buildings. So, you know, that's my area of expertise, but it certainly isn't fire and rescue deployment signs and how to find a flat in a fire. So it may be a common discussion item as a word, but clearly in fire safety, it has a very specific definition.
Okay, so this is work that Paul, well, the two Pauls and others are sort of, you're developing this, aren't you, as part of the ASFP, is it? Is it the Association of?
Sorry, yeah, ASFP are involved on the fringes, and we're working on something with them called the Grey Book. I'm working with some people called NADUC, and we're looking at a training aid for fire damper install and design and selection. And DW145, which is a better publication, is being worked on at the same time. And the whole point is we've got to get all these things to say the same thing, and it's really quite difficult because people aren't looking at it from the pure this is what we need. They're looking at it from the commercial point of view of this is what we've done forever, why have we got to change perspective. And
we don't go with that, but can I offer you again the idea that you should, as part of this kind of diagram, list the information requirements underneath each column, the input information and maybe even the output information, because if we want to check whether sufficient information is being provided to choose an appropriate fire damper, then that's that should be testable.
Yeah, which I think we have. So I don't know. Is it okay to call you Nick or
yes.
Nicholas? Nick. Okay. Nick. Yeah. So, yeah. No. They say that all that sort of information is there because this is a decision tree. So you can't get to that. And there's and Paul's done another bunch of work which I've now put some words to for another group called the PFKG, which is the it's been set up by the tier 1 contractors.
This is the group, isn't it?
Yeah, so we a lot of this is then being moved into this sphere, and again, you need this. If you go down to the next one, actually, George. So you need to know what the building's for, what space risks you've got. You need to know what type of product it's going to be, and this isn't just for fire dampers, it's generally for everything. And then we show an example of a fire damper because then that would affect the type of ventilation calculations that you would do in terms of the ductwork, because you get differing pressure drops. Then you've then got to, having got that far, you've got to determine which type of wall it is so you can see how to mount it, and then the final bit's the mounting instructions. And So you kind of need all of that information to get first to the specification, and so these ones actually show who doesn't have the knowledge. So the building services consultant doesn't understand the products at the moment, doesn't understand the building safety risk because that's come from the architect or the fire engineer. And then the specialist trade just says, well, I've got this wall here and this damper, I've got to install it. And the product supplier just knows what his product does, and he's done some tests to go into certain walls. He doesn't know anything about the project at all. Somebody's just rung him up and ordered a damper.
So who purchases the damper?
Usually either usually the ductwork contractor, or
Right.
potentially the mechanical contractor might purchase it and then free issue it.
So the point is, Nick, that they're ordering the damper without the context of knowing what it's going into or how it's going to be required to perform.
Yeah,
Paul
and if
McSorley's explained to me that if for example, he gave me an example, I can't remember what it was, Paul, but that actually by for good reason, changing a piece of plant that the ductwork is connected to.
Yeah. Shall I explain that bit, George?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So if you've picked the wrong damper and you pick what's termed a curtain fire damper, it's fully open. There's no blades in the way, and therefore it's the cheapest possible option, and it has very little pressure drop. So you would size your fans without a lot of extra pressure drop. And if somebody says, "Oh, you've picked the wrong one, and this protects an escape route," and you've got to put one in like the picture you see there with the blades that are at angles, then you've not only changed the pressure drop capabilities of the system, which is now higher, so you perhaps need a bigger fan. You tend to design ductwork to balance the system as well, so you might need bigger ductwork. And then because of this, you've also got to run cables for electricity and power, because these will need to be motorized, and you'll have to fit, well, hopefully you might have, but you're going to have to cable to the fire alarm system. So the cost could be 5 times as much if somebody missed this, and you've almost got to start again on the design. And this is why it's fundamental that people know where things go and how they should be selected.
But if I can add, George, if you don't know that any of this and the context and the performance, you'll never get the competence requirements right. It's absolutely impossible.
Yes.
So you can't have competent actors. That's the conclusion. So how do we get to competence if this isn't sorted? It's not possible.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to work on at the moment, is how do we make the designers and then the selectors competent to do this?
So if for example, the architect.
But in the designer's competence, there is a designer's competence working group. Is that in it? Sorry to jump in, George.
I think it's highly unlikely, because this has always been somebody else's problem field to be solved on site by the contractor.
And that's the fundamental problem, isn't it? That,
yes,
for example, Mike might have designed, or his team might have designed, what the fire compartments should perform, as far as the dry lining is concerned, and they will probably, hopefully, have provided builders work holes for the ductwork to go through of a certain size based on the design that was given to them.
Yeah.
And then because of, as you say, so the number of people that are involved in this is quite significant, really, isn't it? You've got the M&E consultant, you've got the architect, you've got the trade contractor. The decision, for example, of swapping out one type of damper for another, could that be part of fire engineering?
Well,
Maybe
it would,
fire
it would, it would,
engineers?
it would have to go right back up potentially to the architect and the fire engineer for the compartmentation. Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
then
so
the key point is and you've heard me say this before, the key point is space. If you
Yeah.
page down a few, actually, George.
Yeah.
Depending on which one of these that you've got, keep going. Bit more.
That's it.
That's it. Is it?
Can you share this with me? Would it be possible to share? Yes, I want to do some thinking on this.
Yes. Yeah. No. But this isn't the most recent one, so not this one,
Okay.
Debbie. But I'll speak to Paul. He's it's half term this week, so he's not that available. But we'll get something to you soon. There's a few incarnations, but yeah. No. I mean, so the key point that comes after this is, if the shafts are too small, you can't get to the back of the damper to finish off filling it properly. So people are always looking at lettable space, so they don't want to put in things like shafts. The other thing is that they put they'll put a duct through a wall, whatever construction it is, and they expect it to be the same size as the duct size, and of course it isn't. The hole's always much bigger than that. And it just goes on and on and on as to how complicated this really becomes.
So I guess the point is, for our information side of things, as Nick's saying there, if we can go back to the decision tree thing, if we can identify what the information sets are, presumably here we need to know what the base wall thickness is. Yeah.
Yes.
So these are information requirements for each of those different elements, and the interrelationship between them as well.
And then I mean, so just one of the other points to make about that is when you do a fire test, you tend to test it in what's called a standard supporting construction, which is generally speaking detailed within the test standard, and it tells you once you've tested in that particular type, then you might be allowed to use it in other areas that are thicker and denser. But there's such a proliferation of particularly flexible board type walls that people may well have tested in a wall with two boards on either side, and then they come across the fact that it's three boards and one board fitted into the construction slightly differently, and that's a non-standard supporting construction. So in theory, you have to test every single one of those types of walls. And one of my other colleagues said he went to one site and they got 41 different types of wall in the building.
Crikey.
And you just think, what are people doing? Why? It's a simple thing, because you can imagine that the guy who's building it goes around the corner and keeps putting up the same wall that he was putting up in the other wall, and he won't know that he's supposed to do it differently. And I wonder if I can add
a view to this. I wonder if I can add a view to this. Give some architectural perspective on this. I mean, typically we're never looking to try and produce multiple wall types where we don't want to. When we can, we try to symbolise the wall types and keep them. But obviously there are driving factors to how we get to wall type selections. There's loads of good stuff in those workflows and such like, Paul, that you're doing, but obviously that's only one aspect of a bigger part of a bigger building. So when we're trying to specify partition systems, that alone is a complicated process to get to before we even get close to damper selections and such alike.
Yeah, Mike, that's a really good point. But the point is that everything you put through these walls, so every pipe, every cable, every door has to go through the same decision tree.
Yeah,
it's not just fire dampers. It's all of those items.
I think sorry, my voice today. I think there's a difference between saying the information requirement, the information that the architect has got to provide, and there are several other actors in the sequence there. What your diagram is currently doing, if the answer to the wall type is this or this or this, then you do this and so on. So that's why I'm trying to emphasize that it's a separate. there is an exercise to say, what are the information requirements, and then, and wall type is, and then there's a second thing to say, how many different answers can we have to that in a particular project, and what are the consequences going forward. So all I'm trying to do is suggest that in order to make the diagram accessible to people who aren't fire damper engineer subject matter experts, you've got to, I'm just trying to encourage you to label it up to say this column is called wall type, or this decision is based on space usage, or whatever it happens to be, so that people who aren't already familiar with the process don't get lost in what, the of the diagram.
Yes, I think a lot of that is there. I'm just just going to see, because there's some bits across the top, and I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but I know that there's stuff there. I'm just this is the one that I wanted. So can I
Please.
Can I just share my screen for the moment? As I say, these things have some of these documents have moved on, and I'm not even sure that I've got the most recent one.
Jim, do you want to make a comment just before we go on to this, or are you okay waiting?
No, I'm fine.
Cool.
So I just showed this one, which is interesting, particularly with regard to shaft sizes, and depending on, can people see my cursor?
We can.
Yeah. So a shaft could just be builder's work, or it could have a duct inside it. It doesn't matter. But the point is that if you've got this type of wall here and you have to fit the damper like this, you need access to both sides of it.
Yeah.
If there's a duct in there as well, and then this has got to be connected to the duct, you've got to get in there to do that. So just making things like shafts smaller is very difficult. You also have to allow for breakaway joints and things like that. And this is a three-dimensional problem. And we have, this one shows it quite well. You've got to have space available both for the installation, but then the other point is I don't know whether anybody realizes, but nearly everything now needs to be checked every year. Now, doors are easy. Everybody can get to the doors, but they've got to get to these dampers. They've got to get in there. They've got to look at them. They've got to clean them. They've got to clean the ductwork every year. They've got to clean the shaft every year. And all these requirements need to be built into the design, because if they're not, then we're putting lives at risk because things are not clean and things aren't maintained. And that just gives you an idea of these things are important. And again, this one up here shows you all the things that have got to go through this wall. So you've got the dampers, you've got the pipes and cables. Symmetrical ones are probably okay. Asymmetrical ones, there's probably not any testator. We've got doors. We've got the same with the floors as well. And it's a cute passive fire protection and how you deal with it. And as soon as you stick something through a hole, it's really easy to say in ADB, it needs to be protected by this. But you've got to realize that it's got to be both installed and maintained and be accessible.
So in terms of what Nick was saying there, being able to take the decision tree, is that something that you and Paul and anybody else could identify what the information requirements are at each of those stages?
Yes, I'm sure we can. And the problem is a lot of it, and I think I've said this before, George, is a lot of people will say, I don't need that information, because up to now they haven't, but actually they do, and they need to consider it.
Yeah,
and,
well,
and that's so I think we've got fairly good lists of the information. I mean, elsewhere in that spreadsheet, there's a really scary tick box exercise that Paul's put in there, and it takes 2 minutes to load the Excel file. So And
That's like one with the racy.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the point is you do need to be able to consider these things. You do need to understand that the holes need to be bigger than the ducts. You do need to know that you can't just stick a duct right up against a roof. You've got to give yourself space. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm if we can park that for the minute, that's fantastic. Thank you, Paul. Does everybody agree that approach, having that type of decision tree, would be useful? Good.
Yeah,
assume that.
no, that's fine. I'd say I wasn't expecting to be
Jerry.
doing much talking today.
Jerry. Hello, Jerry.
Hello, sorry. I was just I was thinking it's very interesting actually. I was just thinking about this decision tree and how you would deal with the 42 different types of wall to get, you know, for an architect or whatever, and how this would work in practicalities and the definitions actually of the things, like for instance dampers. I think that's pretty fundamental. If you get these definitions correct and in the British standards in detail, should make things a lot easier for people to interpret. I mean, I'm more from a construction side of things, so you know, I'd be more hands-on in trying to install things and getting jobs done on the site as a construction manager. But the other thing, just there, talking about the competency. I mean, you know, we've been looking at the CSCS. The industry has been de-skilled for so many years now, and it's become a kind of components, isn't it? Really, we've got a lot of components. And they put them together, and there's no, and things have got technology has complicated things quite a bit with different technologies and different standards. That it's going to be very, very hard to get someone can embrace all the different things and take all of these different factors on. You know,
I agree.
this
I
guy
agree if we don't use technology, but you know, we can make all of these standards. We can ensure that if they're updating an occupational standard or a NOS or whatever, that it is traceable to the British standard that says a damper is X. Yes, you know, this can be wired well to minimize it, but also it's about, you know, everybody in the industry, as Dame Judith Hackett said, you've got to be aware of your activities on the activities of others within the context of a system. Yes, so there's an enormous sort of systems, you know, thinking to be done, and that's more about the sort of behavioral stuff. Yes, and leadership in organizations. You know, there's only so much you can do, you know, bottom up in terms of improving the training and competence of installers, and then you get this ghastly word multi-skilled, you know, that everyone wants, and you know, that means many things to different people, so that adds another layer of confusion into the system. Yes, so it is complicated. I totally agree, Jerry, but I think there's ways of wiring this to try and be a bit more exact to help people, but there's just a lack of interest in the sector around sort of machine readability and stuff to do with competence. I don't know why. There's just people just don't think about digitalization in this context. It's really tragic.
Do you think that's a fault of the designers and the delivery consultants, or the demand and requirements of clients, though?
I think it's probably a mixture of both. But you know, how do we influence them? Yes, because you know, there's a lot that gets associated with their risks. Yes, and all the rest if they get this right. So.
Well, can I just add that historically, and I don't want to go too far back, but I am 73. But one of the things that I have noticed in the last 30 years is the reluctance for specialist contractors to share knowledge because it only helps competitors. And the big difficulty around, again, in the last 30 years, a reticence to want to pay for design as a separate thing, most of the specifications that have come across my desk from architects in my own discipline, which is emergency lighting and escape route signing, is that the brief and the specification is totally wrong on the drawing, and I've said this before, from my perspective, and bearing in mind that we were the manufacturer, we didn't actually supply anything, and there was a reticence for the actual specialist contractor to go back and tell the tier one contractor or the architect that there was a specification incorrect, because it would actually help the competitors to tender for the same project. The other thing was that it was also a license to do an amendment at a later stage, because you quote for the incorrect specification and then you make additions and amendments. And so, and I have actually had discussions with procurements. They said, well, just quote for what's on the drawing, and then we'll deal with the technicalities at a later stage. So I think there's also around a culture here around making sure that design work should be done really early in the stage of design and construction. I know I've said it before, but I think it's key to getting things right in the first place.
I don't think we would ever dispute that it's key, but I think what we typically find is that the client expectations and requirements don't necessarily always want all that information very early on, or they have the willingness or appetite to pay for that scope of service. So sometimes it's that iterative process of growing the understanding of a building in which the data is required, but that data isn't requested until later on in the process, which is a failure of the process.
Yeah. One of the points that, so we're now in a regulated industry where we've got to evidence everything. That's principally where I think we're at. And as I think some of you know, we work in a contractually regulated industry. This is as me with my active plan hat on, in PFI hospitals. And in the world of PFI hospitals, unless you can evidence that you've actually done the work, it's considered not to have been done. And if it's not done, then the space that particular activity should have been supporting is then classed as unavailable. And therefore you get penalties. And those penalties can go back to the last time you could evidence that the work had been done properly. And that can go back years. So they end up with millions of pounds worth of penalties. So one of the ways in which they're dealing with it is by having explicit work instructions that people have got to follow. So although somebody's got to be a qualified and competent person, they're actually given an explicit set of instructions. So if I just show you what this is from SFG 20, the BISA publication. Can you see that okay? So these are the tasks that somebody that's doing maintenance and inspection on doors has got to do. This is a monthly inspection. Now, whether that's the right thing to do for all types of doors, whether it's in residential or in healthcare or schools, that's, if you like, a standard from which people can then be checked and assessed. And I'm thinking potentially that's where we ought to be going. So we've got a new work stream that actually starts tomorrow, looking at fire door inspections, and we're basing it on stuff that's come out of the healthcare, out of the NHS. And we've got a team of about 40 volunteers who are fire door experts in BIM4Housing actually coming together to work on this. And
George, if I have all of those tasks, I can put them into engines and it will relate what competences are relevant. Yes, from all of these standards. Yes, so we can drive it, you know, other ways as well. But I'm afraid I've got to drop off in a minute. Otherwise, I'm not going to make a train. I'm really sorry. I'm not going to be here for the last 10 minutes. But I can catch up with you guys later. Thank you very much. It's been very useful.
Thank you, Debbie.
Some actions.
I'll
Thank
feed
you
them
very
over
much,
to
everyone.
you.
Okay, cheers. Yeah.
This is what we're working on tomorrow, and maybe for another session as well, looking at inspecting new fire doors, inspecting existing ones, and then looking at the ongoing inspections. So that type 1 surveys are only done once, as are type 2s. So they're really there to understand what that fire door is, what it's performing, you know, so what it should be, how it should be, and then you've got the ongoing weekly, monthly, 6-monthly, annual inspections, and then that feeds into a robust fire door management plan. So that's what we've got going on tomorrow, that I think is going to generate some good stuff. And what we're hoping to do is have a similar publication to this one that's got some nice examples in it but related to residential. And I'll just explain why that fits in the context of what we've been doing. What we're trying to do, a lot of activity is going on at the moment around producing the plans for the secure information boxes, and which is great, because obviously that's a baseline of information that has got to be captured, but it's only a starting point, and we then need to have competent people look at what those assets are and those fire plans are, and then identify the information about each asset, each smoke vent, each smoke damper, each fire door, to understand what that should be from a performance perspective. And again, this is for both new and existing buildings. The biggest challenge is for existing buildings. So part of the exercise we're starting tomorrow is to be able to go into an existing building, and how do you identify what the specification of that product is if you don't have the O&M information. So that's one of the things that the experts are going to be working on.
Yeah. That was one of my challenge questions, George, is why have you got 3 separate inspection regimes? You know, for new, for existing, and then repeated. Surely there is one inspection regime which you apply.
Well, the experts tell us, Nick, that the challenge is that, first of all, you have to inspect a new fire door when it's installed. Yeah, to make sure it's been installed properly. So that's one series of tasks.
My challenge question is, what's different from thereafter?
No, from thereafter. Step 1 is only ever done once.
Yeah.
On a door. Step 2 is only ever done once on a door, because obviously if you've done step 1, you don't need to do step 2 because you know what it is. But step 2 is for existing buildings where the original does that make sense now?
Sort of.
You don't on the existing doors, you don't necessarily have all the design information, but on the new doors you absolutely should, and if you don't have it, then you're entitled to ask for it and you should be able to get it. The problem with all the legacy stuff, and it's the same with the dampers as well, is you actually have no idea as to what the design is. And one of the things that's becoming even more difficult at the moment is working out what the original fire strategy is.
Yes.
And this goes on even within a contract itself, because people have said, right, well, we'll do this to offset this so we don't have to do this. And then you find out that you've gone through the fire strategy 4 times.
Yep.
And you've said, well, we don't have to do this because we're not doing this anymore, but you're doing this because you had to do it in the first place. And you end up with the actual fire strategy not being right because you've used everything to offset everything else. And then in a building that's moved on, and people have moved things and changed things and said, oh, I don't have to do this because of this, the fire strategy gets completely lost, and it's really quite scary because we're seeing this happening now.
I've got to drop out now. I think documenting reasons why is one of the big challenges for the industry, and protecting it, protecting the reason why. So it's interesting. Sorry for interrupting, George. I'll drop off now.
No,
Let you
thanks,
carry on.
Nick. Yeah. Okay, so then once we've got that, then another part of the new Fire Safety Act is to be able to alert them if any of those assets fail. And that's part of the challenge. But obviously, the residential providers and the authorised persons would also, responsible persons and authorised persons are going to want to also be aware of a particular asset's lack of performance. I think under the new Fire Safety Act, they've got 24 hours or maybe 48 hours to alert the local fire rescue authorities if one of those key assets, like the smoke vent, isn't working. And then obviously what we've then got to do is make sure all of those relate back to the information that's needed for the safety case, which is more holistic than the Fire Safety Act. So that's an exercise that we've got going on tomorrow. If anybody's interested in the outcome of that, like I say, we've got about the objective is to actually produce some clear work instructions for each of these areas. Okay.
Fire doors and emergency lighting are not on that list, though, George, are they? For the fire brigade?
No, they're not. No, so we're not only looking at the things that are on the list for the fire brigade.
All right.
We're looking at things exactly that point. We're looking at all of the key asset types. We've got fire doors tomorrow. We've then got another session to start on next Tuesday, looking at smoke vents. We then want to look at, I think, penetration seals. And I had a really good conversation, Jim, with one of your disciples, Andy Cunningham, is it?
Yeah.
Who says, he speaks very highly of you. But he's doing some amazing stuff on signage. Jerry, would something like this interest you? You're building safety, aren't you?
Yeah, I must admit, I was interested in what you were saying there about the fire doors and considering fire doors, basically, if they're original and the old fire doors with rising butt hinges, if somebody inspects them, if they basically it's providing they're in reasonable condition and the rising butt hinge closes the door against the force of the latch. They're, as far as I'm aware, having read an awful lot of literature, they're still compliant.
Yeah, I think one of the things for landlords is they're getting so much conflicting advice, and what we're trying to do here is distill that down. So, for example, I was talking to a fire door manufacturer this morning, and he said, well, any fire door that's before 2015 isn't compliant. That's it, black and white.
Right.
And he said that, and I said, so why is that? And he said, well, it has to have been tested from both sides, and before 2015, it wasn't. There weren't. So in other words, the fire protection, if for example they're tested in line with the fire starting in the flat and coming out, but obviously if the fire is already in the corridors, then it comes back in. And I said to him, well, from the advice I'm being given, it's also a matter of what the size of the risk is. So it needs to be risk based. And if, for example, it might be that you've there's a range of different considerations, and you can't just write off 1,000 or 5,000 fire doors simply because they don't have the right documentation, for example. The fire engineers or the people who are the experts will do that, will make that assessment based on a risk-based approach. Yeah. That's what I've been told. So there's a range of different things there. Bex, you've got a comment.
Yeah, so on what Live West are doing in our high risk building, our stance is we would like every single door in that building to be a certified fire door. So the ones that, the flat entrance and the communal doors. Therefore, we have asked our survey to go out. If there's evidence that they're certified, we ease and adjust, or we leave them, or whatever needs to happen happens. But if they're not, we need that certification as part of the golden thread. So that's the stance we're taking, only in the high risk, but that gives us the comfort then and the data that those can meet the building safety regulators requirements.
But the certification, Bex, would that mean that if you didn't have the certificate for that door that may have only been put in 3 or 4 years ago, does that mean that you would replace it with a door that was certified?
Correct. If we can't find the proof that that door is a certified door, if a certified door is installed in the last 3 years, we should either have the documentation somewhere, or it would have the plug or the stamp or some evidence that that door is certified. If we don't have that, there's no proof that the door is certified. That we just don't have that proof. Therefore, we don't have that assurance to provide to any regulator that it is certified. Because if that's our blanket rule for the HRBs, that's our blanket rule for the HRBs.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Can I just be very clear? Is that for the full set or just the door?
I do believe it's the certification is noted on the door, but it applies to the full set because we're getting the architraves and the surrounds done as part of works that we've currently got underway anyway. So I'm not a fire door professional, but that's the brief I've been given.
I'm not either. So I was just clearing it in my own mind because on the last session here we were made very clear that the door could be perfect, but if the set is not correct, then the fire just goes round it. So
precisely, and that's where we would so our fire survey will look at one of that. They've got a checklist, and so the first one is obviously, is the door certified? Yes, no. And then they'll look at the set and whether they have to ease and adjust or make any just make it so it is compliant. So that it is the whole, I think, in answer to your question. Yes.
Thanks. I didn't want
I was just going to try and make the point that if you've got very, very old doors, somebody mentioned rising butt hinges. The point is that when they were installed, the regulation at the time, they were probably adequate. Now, I don't know how you determine that. I mean, I have a situation. I went and checked on a building with a smoke control system, and then I finally asked when it was built, and then I discovered that the legislation that was actually in place was, I think, a 1978 standard. And therefore, as far as I could see, it had been installed as it should have been. You wouldn't install it that way now, but at the time, it would have been compliant. The issue was I couldn't check it because the smoke exit routes were through all the flats. And
Yeah.
you try getting into an expensive flat to go and fiddle around. It doesn't happen.
These are
things that these things that are different.
I did have the very same discussion with an enforcing officer, and he made it very clear to me now that what you're saying is perfectly correct when the statutory bar was in place. With current legislation, there's no statutory bar now, and what is law is what the law is now. So
that's what we're doing. So we're doing a line in the sand. You know, we know from this point in time, all of our doors are certified and compliant. We are happy then that what we have got on site is going to satisfy the building safety regulator. We couldn't guarantee that if it was done by 1978 regulations. So we had to have that line in the sand. And going forward, they'll be inspected as per the regime and the recommended fire door inspection, but based on our line in the sand that they're all certified as of current.
Yeah. Can I just throw something in there? If you've actually inspected the door and it's exactly as it was when it was built in 1971, and it closes against the force of the latch, it may not meet current standards, but I didn't think the building regs was retrospective in terms of fire doors and the like. So
it's the point of evidence. We need to provide evidence to the building safety regulator that our building is safe. And what we've defined as evidence that our building is safe is it safe now? Not was it safe 20 years ago? Is it safe now? And it, you know, some people are taking a different stance. You know, they'll go and get the doors checked and inspected, and it might be a case that they don't have the requirement for certified doors, just nominal doors or notional doors.
That's what we're doing.
Again, yeah, and I know that we're doing that across other schemes that aren't so high risk, and that's the stance we're taking on those. But for our higher risk buildings where we have to provide that evidence, then we are providing that evidence.
Sure. I think the point is, as you say, Bex, it's down to individual landlords as to what the rules are that they're following, and certainly one of the challenges I think I've spoken to councils that I spoke to one council, they're replacing 3,500 fire doors, and when they've done the checks, they've done spot checks on them, they've found that only 20% of them are actually passing. The brand new ones that they're actually having installed are passing because of quality of workmanship, I guess. You know, so that's extraordinary. But the point is that I think, as you say, it's down to how you demonstrate to the building safety regulator that it's safe, and it may be that I think Jim was saying there, or Jerry was saying, something that's maybe been installed and is safe, is considered to be safe, and a competent fire risk assessor has said that it will perform, then that's the decision that can be taken. And I think there can be a situation where if the people that are doing inspections are also manufacturers, there's a bit of a vested interest there.
You're absolutely right. Hit the nail on the head. However, we've got to accept and appreciate the professionals' advice. And there's, you know, of
course.
And again, that's an approach we're taking internally, and we have our own processes. And
no, absolutely. Cool.
But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
sorry, just to jump back in there, we've actually recruited some people to actually carry out inspections of doors, and we're having them all trained up to inspect doors, so they're going to be certified. So that's kind of our back into what we're doing, you know.
Yeah, we've got a very newly developed and they're getting certified as well, internal fire door team who will look after it going forward.
Yeah.
But because of the regime that I don't think we've got the resource at current to hit the ground running. So that's why we're addressing the higher risk buildings as we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be both Jerry and Bex. You might want to be looking at what is coming out of the type 3 work that we're doing at the moment, which is that ongoing one. So we'll I'll keep you in the loop on that.
That'd be brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good.
Just to finish on that, we are talking specifically there, Bex, about above 11 meters. You are doing something that's proportional and appropriate for, let's say, ordinary buildings like offices and other parts of the civic environment.
Correct. We have a whole fire door team who are assessing, doing a risk-based approach on all of our assets. So I don't have the site of that, I'm afraid, so I can't give you any detail. But
I meant with anything that you have historically, you don't need to go and change 4-inch thick oak doors because there's no certificate in places of historical interest and places like that.
We don't actually have that sort. I don't know whether we have that sort of building, but I know for our higher risk portfolio, it doesn't really fall into that category. And those are the ones that we require certified. The rest, I think, we're going on a notional. We're inspecting and we're tracking, and we've got an app that we do that with. And so we can make sure we track and every door is compliant, but certified is only the higher risk buildings.
Because that's why I was being very specific about the legislation not being retrospective. So in above 11 meters, you can't rely on old legislation, but for other buildings, I agree, it's purely a risk assessment basis about whether you that door will meet its notional requirements.
Bex, you just mentioned an app that you're using. Which one is that? Do you mind me asking?
It's Propeller.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
I haven't had any experience with it. Again, this lies with our fire door specialist team, but that is the one that they're using, and it's sort of a QR code based tagging system. So when you're on site, you can QR code it, see what the characteristics of that door is, and update as necessary.
And that's something that Live West managing rather than a third party fire door inspector.
The way, again, not knowing the ins and outs of the fire door team, the way I see that it's progressing is they're training up internally, and we will have Live West employees certified to carry out those inspections and use the software Propeller to manage that information.
That's good. Yeah, I'm asking the question because what we're finding is that we different manufacturers, for example, are providing the information about the door that they've installed in an app. Yeah, so when that's what they call their golden thread. So they've got maybe an RFID tag or something like that in the door, and that's referenced back to an app, which they think is a good idea, which it obviously is. But if you've got 3 or 4 different door types in your building, then you end up with 3 or 4 different. If you've got doors from 3 or 4 different suppliers, you could end up with 3 or 4 different apps.
Precisely, and that's why we are putting all of our information into one basket, as it were, and using that as our compliance.
I'd be interested if you could put me in touch with anybody at Propeller. That would be. I will
see if helpful. I can get a contact for you.
Cool. Okay. Right. We've run over, but I think it's been helpful. So is there anything anybody else has got to say? Richard, you've just come on camera.
Oh yeah, no, I was just come on camera to say goodbye. Don't worry.
Okay.
You know I never delay the meeting ending.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say, Jim? You're on mute. Yeah.
No, I'm fine. Fine.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks very much for everybody for your time.
Okay, have you got 5 minutes, George, after we finished?
See you next time.
Right.
Cheers. Bye-bye.